There's a kind of a straightforward question from the audience. How many of the company failures that you study can be attributed to those illusions of synergy? Is that one of the ones that that jumps out as a particularly addictive one?
The largest category of failures was probably adjacency.
Yeah.
But synergy was a close second.
Yeah. I mean, I find that, you know, I mean, there's always, I think, reflexive skepticism of whether, let's just say it's an M&A deal, it's announced, and you know, you sort of very transparently see that the synergy number is reverse engineered, right, to how to justify the price. Yeah. Right. I would also point out, my observation is that a lot of the assumptions that went into each of the bank stress test, you know, here's how we're going to get the capital, are essentially either synergy or just sort of aggressive earnings assumptions. So any process is susceptible to that.
I think that, I mean, quite honestly, I think those numbers are always worthless.
Right.
You can't really understand those numbers unless you understand the assumptions behind them.
Right.
So if somebody won't give you explicitly what their forecast numbers are that lead to those various scenarios, right, then, you know, disregard it if you can.
The 3 million jobs that'll be created by the stimulus, right?
Yeah.
You have to know kind of how many would otherwise be, you know,
right,
be created, all the rest of that. Do you think there's a correlation between management compensation and decision making, or bad decisions, you know, do they tend to be made to optimize management compensation?
Everything is always done to optimize management compensation. Not just in the executive suite, but throughout the organization.
Right.
You know, you're never going to get a deal or any kind of major strategy looked at that doesn't have a discussion about, you know, what does this mean for our profit pool? What does this mean for our compensation? I mean, I think it's both human nature and natural and part of capitalism.
What about compensation policies or standards? Are there better and worse ones? I mean, obviously a lot of the blame for the whole kind of credit boom and bust is being laid at the sort of short-term compensation setup.
You know, the problem with compensation issues are always linked, I think. I'm not sure if they're the cause. The problem is that no one has a good answer for the alternative schemes, because somehow we can engineer around whatever scheme there is. I think a more important determiner is the culture, right, of the organization, the value system, the management team, and the decision-making process. So, you know, if you look at the guys at Goldman, the culture, the compensation is pretty good, right? But they had a culture in terms of how they dealt with risk and in terms of how they made decisions that was different from many of their peers. I think that's a more critical determinant.
I wanted to actually get to the idea of culture. I mean, I know it's a hard to characterize thing, and probably even harder to change. I mean, I think everyone's going to agree that organizations tend to have this culture that accrues over many years. I guess how do you sort of recognize and then move to change what you think is not a culture conducive to success?
Well, I think you look at it both from a personal and organizational standpoint. We're hoping that this research will jog leaders into at least considering changes in the way they make decisions, and at least puts in front of them, or perhaps puts in front of the board, a set of questions that can be asked to go over, you know, as a course of analyzing the things in front of them. But from a personal standpoint, I think you have to ask yourself, if you're in a situation where your objections, your concerns aren't going to be addressed, and you know that, you know, is that the kind of environment that you want to be in?
Right.
And, you know, doesn't mean that you walk away today, but you have to make sure there's a personal fit with what you need.
All right, this one is a kind of put you on the spot question from out there. While the book is based on historic failures, can you identify companies that are at risk of potential failures based on patterns that you've identified? What companies might be on that list? So here you go. You get to knock some down.
Well,
first we have to know, you know, a roster of companies represented.
No, that's okay. I'd rather do it without it. You know, many of us have been talking about you know, the whole news industry, right, as being on the Kodak path. And this is also one of those situations where they understand the technology very well, and it's really a business model transition that they're grappling with. The day after the the announcement of the Bank of America Merrill Lynch acquisition, we wrote in our blog that Bank of America was likely to be the next Conseco. Because they didn't really understand the depth of what they were buying.
Right.
They wanted the brokers, but they didn't understand the depth of the toxicity
right.
around its, around the securities it was buying. I think, I mean, that's probably the example that jumps out at me.
And that's and that's obviously probably the ultimate, hot environment for making a decision too, in terms of how BofA came about doing that, whether they were pressured or not.
Well, the parallels are extraordinary. Conseco, Conseco was buying something that the rest of the market was fleeing, and they didn't understand the depths of the problem. Bank of America was buying something the rest of the market was fleeing. The prices were essentially going down, so at the very least they could have bought it for a lot less had they waited a week. And they did it in essentially over an hour's negotiation over the phone, and 2 days of due diligence.
Right. Oh, that's remarkable. Well, how can an IRO be an effective voice of dissent or challenge within a heavy sycophantic organization when dissent is not rewarded? That's why these questions are anonymous.
Well, the thing I would recommend is to have a long-range plan for how you squeeze out a little bit of openness, right? You have to start looking at the conversation now. Can you put some wedge into that talks about kinds of questions that need to be asked now? Can you look at the board as a potential mechanism? I'm not suggesting the IRR goes and starts mucking around the CEO board process, because that's certainly a recipe for disaster. But you can feed this kind of information to make sure everybody has the perspective. And then ultimately, if it's that bad, what can it?
Or you could propose the whole, drunk decision, sober decision.
Well, we find that actually goes over pretty well.
Well, as long as those decisions you're making while drunk can be actually revisited, and
yes,
not the kinds of things that once they're done they can't be undone. What's your view of government's intervention in private enterprise and perhaps impact on companies' ability to make strategic decisions? Do you think there's going to be anything enduring there?
It's. I think one of the things it calls for is that an element of future scenarios with potential regulatory intervention is something that most industries aren't used to contemplating, right, in their strategic decisions, and now you have to think about it, right. So one of the things that we think you need to do as a part of this final review is to look at alternative future scenarios, right, the kinds of environments that your strategy might have to compete in that's different from what things are today, and that's certainly one of them.
Right. How often should you revisit a strategy? Quarterly, 6 months, every year? Do you think there should be a process for periodically doing that?
Yeah, I think that there's one of the things we recommend in the book is having essentially an explicit articulation of the assumptions under which your strategies are based, right? So what kind of customer behavior, what kind of market conditions, and those are the things you can go back and revisit. I think it's hard to go back and revisit a strategy per se when things are going forward, but you should certainly make sure you understand what the underlying assumptions are and whether or not things are changing.
Right. It's the Keynes line, when circumstances change, I change my view. What do you do?
Right.
Well, that's the